Campbell is at once also scholarly. He is at the same time someone who is bent on getting through to the practical aspects of living and popularizing the study of comparative mythology. And so instead of just trying to make an objective science out of comparative myth, he's also trying to get through to people, and he has a certain message. In other words, he does have an axe to grind. He does indeed have something that he's trying to say throughout his works. And so, this is something that we should keep in mind, but more than keep in mind, this is something that I want to point out as generally true for the scholars, the commentators, the comparativists that we're going to read. Everyone has a certain bias. There is something that is very difficult to get away from with this, and it's not even clear with respect to religion if you want to get away from it. Because if you do try and make a completely plain and objective account of a particular religion, it's not clear that it's even the same religion as what it would be if it was an impassioned, first-person sort of believer's account. Someone who is very much entrenched in that religion. That has a quality to it. An account like that has a certain feel to it that a coldly clinical account does not and cannot, perhaps. And so, in other words, instead of apologizing for the lack of objectivity from time to time and the claims that Campbell is going to put forth and many others are going to put forth in the course, instead I'm going to say that this is not only a good thing, that they have opinions, that they have some feel for what is important with religion, but in fact this is something that is unavoidable in the study. That if you don't have an axe to grind and you are instead trying to maintain objectivity as though you had no personal interest in what it is that you're studying, then in fact that is your axe to grind. That is your bias in wanting to make a science out of it and wanting to make a more objective presentation out of it than others might want to, because what we consistently hear is when someone tries to provide a kind of objective or outsider's account of what a particular religion is like, when an insider takes a look at that and says, wow, that's really just not the lived experience that I have at all, and you've missed the point. And if that's the case, then it's difficult. That's the kind of thing that's difficult to overcome. It's not as though we can simply say, well, if you go out and do the measurements, if you do the experiments, then you can see for yourself, and avoid the first-person bias in that way. Religion is the kind of thing that what we are studying in part at least, and this is where I think Campbell is good and where this tradition is interesting, we are studying the psychological effect, at least in part, of what religion has on people. In other words, I'm not saying that religion is only the psychological effect, but what I am saying is that subjective component, what it's like for someone to be involved in a religion, the lived daily experience of what it's like for someone who really feels the religion to be important, that aspect of the religion is not incidental. In other words, it's something that is not a throwaway. That's something that we should take seriously as we are considering the history of religions, which informs in part one of the goals in presenting the different systems is to try and give you some sense of what that lived experience is like, how it is that someone actually could believe in the Greek gods, how it is that one actually could live in a way that someone sees these things as manifest everywhere. When you see the lightning in the sky, you're not just thinking, oh, I believe that's Zeus. You actually see that as Zeus. Why it is that that's different. And this is going to be important. And in fact, this is something that if you read enough of Campbell's work, you're going to encounter over and over again in his talk of metaphor, and saying that the metaphor, John is a deer, is different, completely different than the simile, John is like a deer. So in saying John is a deer, we are doing something different than simply saying that he is like one. In other words, it's not a mere rhetorical ornament, that there's actually some content being communicated in trying to draw that identification. Now, one other thing that's very interesting in Campbell's work, and this is something that we also got in Frazer, but Frazer is more of an encyclopedist with this. I mean, he has a theory that he's forwarding, but the bulk of his work is involved in telling these different stories. Campbell's work is not of that same character. However, he does like to tell stories. And so in the middle of the selection, that you're reading, you have a number of ideas presented, and then all of a sudden there are a couple of long stories. And the chapter, in fact, ends when the story ends. So this is interesting, and it's interesting in the same way that the myth of error in Plato's Republic, so this is book 10 of Plato's Republic, caps that work. So you have a work of philosophy for 9 books in Plato's Republic, and then the 10th book is a myth. And the book ends with the myth. And that's interesting. I mean, it's strange to us, right? I mean, you have a work of philosophy, you're forwarding arguments, and then you end in myth. And surely that makes a substantive commentary on what can be said, the manner of presentation, how it is that telling the story of a myth makes a difference, what impact that has rhetorically. There are some interesting things happening there that are worth thinking about. And this is true for Campbell as well. And so what I want to draw your attention to is this tendency to tell stories, this wanting to tell stories for rhetorical effect or for whatever it is that we think is valuable about these stories. There's something beautiful in the telling of the stories. Now, in the, I'm told, 19th century universities, and Yale is the particular university that I heard this story about, so I'll tell it in that context. I heard that the English department, you had professors that would go up and they would provide these impassioned narratives of, reading a particular piece. And that was the content of the lecture. And it was not so much theory of literature as it was a presentation of it. And this is something that is largely lost in modern philosophical rhetoric, modern philosophical writing. It's not entirely lost, however, and where it isn't, it sticks out. And it sticks out as something unusual. And I'm thinking in particular of environmental philosophy, and I don't know if you've read very much of environmental philosophy, but it's very interesting in this particular respect, because environmental philosophers like telling stories about the environment, and they like telling stories about, walking out into, the fresh, clean air with a particular taste to the experience. It's almost like an extended haiku in trying to capture what it's like of that experience. And the implication is that aspect of the experience matters for the philosophy. That somehow that quality of lived experience that is not capturable, it's not possible to be talked about outside of the story. So in other words, you have to talk about the story. That's valuable. And that's interesting. Now, in religion, it may be a bit more obvious that the stories are valuable. If they weren't valuable, then why would we even be studying this, perhaps? So it really stands out in environmental philosophy more than it would here. But nevertheless, here, I think it at least should stand out to you that we're not just talking about dry theory abstracted from the stories, that in fact the stories themselves sometimes are an integral part of the presentation. And so in Frazer, we can think, okay, well, we have this kind of encyclopedia. He's presenting them, he's juxtaposing them, as I argued, with respect to some kind of tendency, playing upon our tendency for abstraction in understanding the stories and coming to see commonalities, and that's all well and good. In Campbell, even though you have that same kind of tendency of presenting a number of stories side by side that are similar, there is also something else going on, I think. And there is an appeal to the beauty of the story itself. And this is something that if we look in Campbell's own biography, it's very clear. He had a love for especially Native American mythology. And so his presentation of those stories, I think, does communicate a certain love for the stories. And this is no mere aesthetic thing, that it actually plays importantly into what it is that he's saying. So in other words, the presentation of those stories has content in itself above and beyond the stories. The stories actually provide something of content philosophically.